So this is part of an ongoing project, and what I will do is I will present some general parts of the project, which is called Schwarz-Sein, and then I will present a few sort of shorter entries that I'll explain in a second. But I want to start with an epigraph from Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging. To have one's belonging lodged in a metaphor is, no, sorry. I don't know what is going on. I will just do that. To live in the Black diaspora is, I think, to live as a fiction, a creation of empires and also a self-creation. The recent embrace of all that is non-human, post-human, inhuman, in the broader field of cultural studies, appearing under the guise of posthumanism, eco-criticism, studies of the Anthropocene, animal studies, new materialism, or object-oriented realism, has once again failed to systematically address the question of Blackness and the mattering of Black life, which is to say that there's no sphere of the non-human untouched by the multitudinous and expansive forces of racialized gendering, what I'm calling Schwarz-Sein. Seeking to better understand the non-human, we would do well to route this journey through and root it in the relational mattering of Schwarz-Sein. I'm interested in excavating the fantastically human and non-human, organic and inorganic vibrational frequencies of Black life in the present and in the past as a series of mattering praxis, of Black livingness, of how we be. My talk today is taken from my longer project, which seeks to establish the different ways that Blackness operates as the ontological mattering of ungendering. This allows me to conceptualize Blackness as integral to being as such and imagine how its compound manifestations matter and reverberate both through and beyond the category of the human. I'm envisioning this project in the form of an alternate periodic table as a living diagram that collates some of the organic and inorganic elements that comprise the mattering of Black life. Besides the entries that I will, or the elements that I'll present today, some of the other elements that I have so far are blood, cosmos, dragon, falsetto, glitter, diagrammatics, heartbreak, photograph, rope, and water. Rather than seeking to reproduce the epistemological provenances of the system format, the periodic table, I'm concerned with what the arrangements of elements pertaining to Black life into the format of a periodic table makes possible conceptually and aesthetically. And I'll just leave it there for now. So the first entry, which is kind of the explanation of the project or the philosophical basis of the project, is Schwarz-Sein, or be with a subscript 2. In his philosophy of being, Martin Heidegger deploys the term Dasein, which in German signifies a mode of being, rather than subjectivity or individuality. And he does so with the purpose of not collapsing the human into being as such. Rather, Dasein denotes the sphere of being that establishes beings and things as individuated entities. Despite this important distinction, Heidegger noticeably differentiates between man's capacity for world forming, the animal's poverty in world, and the absolute worldlessness of the stone. For Heidegger, the tiered distinction between humans, animals, and minerals comes into existence primarily through the different ways that these beings relate to mortality. He writes, "Death is the ownmost possibility of Dasein. Being toward it discloses to Dasein its ownmost potentiality of being, in which it is concerned about being of Dasein absolutely. The ownmost possibility is non-relational. It's unbezüglich," end quote. The non-relational finality of death, or finitude in the Heideggerian vernacular, creates self-reflexivity for the individual, unconcealing to them that they are not only a particular being, but also form a part of the ontological sphere of Dasein. The profound familiarity with one's own possible worldly demise leads to an authentic recognition of Dasein, which also constitutes the basis for man's ability to form world, as opposed to the animal and the stone. Not surprisingly, in Heidegger's logic, this schema cannot but exclude the Jew and the Negro. They are worldless, just like the stone. And I'm happy to talk about that in questions and answers in the discussion later. I'm not going to dwell on it because Heidegger is very much a stepping stone for me to get where I need to go, and definitely not the destination. Remaining in the clearing of being towards death, Heidegger argues that in contradiction to man's own death, and I'm quoting here, this is the second one, quote here, we do not experience the dying of others in a genuine sense. We are, at best, always just there too. Wir sind nur dabei. Even as man's sincere encounter with the potentiality of his or her own mortality grants them the coveted entry into the exclusive Daseinsclub, the death of others, according to Heidegger, must remain beached beyond the shores of being there. I'm left speculating what if in all the difficult labor of eternally having to inhabit a trope, to be a fiction, as per Brand, we cannot but experience the death of others relationally, even if only opaquely so, because it vibrates at frequencies similar to our own most mortality. Put differently, what might all this mean for Schwarz-Sein's relationship to death? Or, in Saidiya Hartman's formulation, the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, be those lives in the forms of humans, cultures, languages, names, genders, origins, belongings, etc. I'm asking how our over-acquaintance with not only the dead and dying per se, but the lives of the dead, the lives they lived, and those that continue to exist in other dimensions, can establish the nucleus for an ontology of Schwarz-Sein. If to exist in the Black diaspora is to live as a fiction, as the eternal return of being somebody else, then it represents an ontological fabrication produced by the mattering of the enduring vitalities of the dearly right here departed in our Black lives. For those beings to be not being, and I'm quoting from Edouard Glissant here, for those who do not have recourse to that which would pre-exist relation, i.e. the vacuity of being as being. It becomes impracticable to not apprehend the lives of the dead as mattering opacities or privations with palpable presences that continue to structure the ownmost potentiality of being Black of Schwarz-Sein. I utilize the compound Schwarz-Sein both to vaccinate the Heideggerian oeuvre with a dose of ontological melanin, and because it is the translation for the English language term Blackness. So until very recently, there was no term specifically for Blackness in the German language, and Black German activists and academics about 10, 15 years ago introduced this term into the lexicon of the German language. So for me, I'm sort of coming at it from the Heidegger direction, but also the direction that this is very much a term that was created by Black people for Black people within the German language. Additionally, in strict opposition to the lion's share of words in the German language, particularly those associated with the worldliness of human and non-human animals, Dasein is not grammatically garmented in a dimorphically gender-definite article, die, der. Instead, it is qualified by the gender-neutral das. I want the path from Dasein to Schwarz-Sein and back to play a pivotal role in theorizing the ontological frequencies of ungendering as the enfolded mattering of belonging to unbelonging, the enfolded mattering of belonging to unbelonging. In an analogous fashion, Sylvia Winter asks, how do we be, in Fanonian terms, hybridly human? Here, Winter adopts the habitual be, also referred to as B2 subscript, also as non-finite B and invariant B, which is one of the grammatical hallmarks of Black American English. Russell and John Rickford describe this use of the verb to be as distinctive because it occurs rarely or not at all in white vernaculars, adding that outsiders believe that Black folk replace standard English is and are with invariant be all the time, But AAVE, African American Vernacular English, is actually more discriminating. For one thing, invariant habitual B describes only an event that is performed regularly or habitually. Furthermore, unlike ASHI, invariant habitual B is more than an isolated AAVE word. It is part of the grammatical system, an integral tile in the mosaic of the dialect. And here's the full quote. I was quoting there from Rickford and Rickford. Though in some cases, visually detectable dryness on melanated human skin could also be carried out repetitively, habitual B boosts the vigorous and continual Sein of Schwarz-Sein, the praxis of Black Lives Mattering, the vibrations of its diagrammatic frequencies. According to June Jordan, this vibrational praxis results from Black life's intimacy with the lives of the dead, seeing that African American Vernacular English, and I'm quoting now, has been constantly threatened by annihilation, or at least the swallowed blurring of assimilation. The amalgamation schemes that Chris was talking about yesterday, among other things. And consequently, AAVE is a system constructed by people constantly needing to insist that we exist, that we are present, end quote. Jordan continues her rumination on the ontological frequencies of Black English in the following fashion. There is no passive voice in construction possible in Black English. For example, you cannot say Black English is being eliminated. You must say white people eliminating Black English. The assumption of the presence of life governs all of Black English, end quote. Thus, the habitual B and the general and essential ontological liveness of AAVE provide linguistic instantiations of Black life, just as Schwarz-Sein refashions and swathes the Heideggerian notion of Dasein. They represent Dasein as an enfleshed fiction, both a self-creation and a production of empires. And on to the next section. Terrorist. I feel like I'm cheating a little bit because I'm giving several terms, but it is what it is. They're all subterms of Schwarz-Sein. As part of the various anti-terror initiatives in the wake of September 11th, 2001, the Department of Homeland Security launched a program called Countering Violent Extremism, CVE henceforth, in 2015, which has as its goal to fund local organizations in order to stave off youth radicalization, in quotation marks there, especially in Muslim communities. It has been the tendency of the CVE and other anti-terror initiatives to single out Black Muslims, whether US or foreign-born, for increased surveillance, policing, and criminalization, even though they now constitute a minority within the overall US Muslim population, and despite the recent racialized orientalization of Islam as Arab and South Asian in the US. According to Pew Research Center, 20% of US Muslims are Black, while only 6% are foreign-born and Black, right? And this just to highlight how small the number, but how high the surveillance and the policing and the violence is, or intense. Despite these numbers, we should note, as several critics have done, how Blackness has been and continues to be central to the histories, engagements, entanglements, and experiences of US American Islam. And we can say just somewhat more programmatically that until 2001 in the United States, Islam was very much a Black religion and has now, at least in the kind of public conception, ceased to be so, even though in places such as Philadelphia, it is still very much a Black religion. As opposed to direct policing and surveillance measures, the CVE was designed to facilitate the agency of young US Muslim men through after-school programs, for example, by offering them, there are a lot of quotation marks here that I won't rehearse, but by offering them the opportunity to choose to not become engulfed by radicalization and subsequently join a violent extremist group such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, or ISIS. That is, the after-school programs funded by the CVE in Minneapolis and other US cities with a large Black Muslim population operate under the assumption of the innate criminality exhibited by young Black Muslim men. Conversely, Black Muslim women fall outside of the image of the helpless Muslim woman in need of rescue by the West because they're too Black, too ungendered, too queer. At times, they're enfolded into these violent discourses as handmaidens to warlords and terrorists by being welfare queens, especially in the Canadian context. In the Western imagination, Somali women, for instance, only appear as helpless and in need of saving by images of famine and starvation, usually linked to the fate of their dying children, but never themselves, but not because they are Muslim, as in the case of brown women. As many scholars of Orientalism have shown, there's been a long tradition of feminizing the Orient, and I would add of Orientalizing femininity as well. That is the many ways in which femininity has not only become synonymous with Islam and the Orient, but it has become one of the main strategies of describing and thinking about femininity, particularly in opposition to the lack of proper femininity in the contemporary West. Think of all the things that happen under the guise of sex tourism and mail order brides, right? Take, for example, how the West, in the West, the burqa and the niqab work as allochthonic technologies of racialization, since they locate brown Muslim women and by extension all of the Islamic world in an earlier, more unsophisticated time and space. Its positioning in turn also underscores how much more civilized and enlightened the Western world is about gender equality than the backwaters of the global South. My point is that despite being often visible as Muslim, Black Muslim women rarely benefit from this particular acutely gendered orientalizing technology, whether they're situated in the West or not. In the eyes of the West, Schwarz-Sein bars them from access to proper femininity, while misogynoir cancels out gendered Orientalism. In the 2015 film Nazan Malik, which depicts a day in the life of two Black Muslim teenagers in Brooklyn who are keeping their burgeoning queerness and budding sexual relationship hidden from their families. The NYPD's demographic unit and the FBI begin to suspect and surveil the two young men because, as Black Muslims, they're always already presumed to be criminal. What is striking is that most of the actions that the authorities deem suspect and take as indicators of Black Muslim ontological delinquency are Malik and Naz's surreptitious queer acts of loving and sexing in semi-public, because they cannot do so at home, even though they do that as well. In one such moment, the FBI agent follows Naz and Malik as they slip away into a side street, thinking they're plotting a terrorist attack, when in fact they're simply looking for a spot to passionately kiss and fondle each other, given that this would be difficult at home or at school.
I want to, but I'm not going to.
Then we see the FBI officer there who's been following them around. I highly recommend the film. It's not good, but definitely worth watching. The two main characters and the actors are amazing, but the plot is just, there's not much that's redeemable about it. But, you know, here we are. Because Naz and Malik are Black Muslims, and given that both Blackness and Islam are frequently deemed antithetical to queerness, their queer acts of sociality, intimacy, tenderness, and erotics become both potentially felonious and resistant by virtue of existing in the frequential orbit of the U.S. state power, here embodied by both the NYPD and FBI agents. What is important in this context, beyond Black queer Muslim love, lust as liberatory praxis, is that Malik and Naz's doings and affects are not in direct response to state power and surveillance. For most of the film, they're not even aware that they're being surveyed, right? Yet these acts are deemed ontologically in excess of the law, or at least suspect in the eyes of law enforcement officers, and by extension state power, because they're carried out by young Black Muslim men in a US urban environment. Schwarz-Sein here, in the form of Black queer Muslim semi-public intimacy, must be quashed by any means necessary. And I think I'm going to jump over the next section, which is one of my favorite sections, but I actually want to talk about a few sections that I'm currently working on very actively. So I highly recommend that video and this video.
Welcome you to Los Angeles, and may I ask you?
So one of the sections that I'm working on is in conversation with Cameron Rowlands, one of the pieces from an exhibit that he did, Amt 45i in Frankfurt last year, that was very much about excavating the ways that Germany was enmeshed, or what would later become Germany was enmeshed in the transatlantic slave trade. Right? Because that is something that is usually not visible. Germany has a very hard time even recognizing their colonial past, let alone a past that has to do with the African continent and transatlantic slavery. So that there were some direct involvements in transatlantic slavery, but I found that this particular example of the what was called in English Negro cloths, or Osnaburgs, that were made in Osnabrück in Germany, is a kind of more interesting object or entanglement or element here. And I'm just going to read here from the exhibition catalog that Cameron Rowland wrote. Cheap, coarse German linens were also a preferred textile for the clothes of enslaved people. Osnaburgs or Osnabrigs were made in Osnabrück, and according to a 1744 report on the British linen trade, all the Negroes in the colonies were generally clothed in German linens, called Osnaburgs. Another report indicated that all 70,000 enslaved people in Barbados were usually clothed in foreign Osnaburgs. This practice translated into law in instances where the slave codes prohibited enslaved people from wearing anything other than Negro cloth. German merchants made their linen a staple of the slave economy by ensuring its competitive pricing. The standardization of German linen as Negro cloth and as currency for purchasing Black people as slaves created a growing market for this product. So I'm really interested in the actual materiality of the linen, but of course also how it feeds into the transatlantic slave trade, both directly in terms of it being a currency, but also in this more indirect way that this becomes a uniform. And to kind of think about, this is in the middle of the 18th century, how does this linen get to Barbados and become the standard clothing for enslaved people, right? So many things have to happen there in order for that for that to occur. And then another section that I'm working on is called Genozid, the German word for genocide, and it is about a group of Black German children that were referred to as brown babies that were born in the aftermath of the Second World War to Black German GIs and white German mothers. And if you look at German history, you'll see, for instance, there's a panic about biracial German children in the colonies, particularly German Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia. German citizenship law from 1912, I believe, to 2000 was basically based on the idea that no one from the colonies, particularly the German colonies on the African continent, should be able to claim German citizenship, right? So you have those group of children that create this moral panic and shape German citizenship laws. And then in the in between the First and the Second World War, there's a group of children that are born to French. Well, not French, actually, African soldiers in the French army that are stationed in the Rhineland region of Germany, and they're referred to as Rhineland bastards. And many of those children, once they became adults, were sterilized during the Third Reich, right? So there's all these ways in which Black German children are deemed as not belonging to the German nation, and all these kind of violent ways in which that is made to come true, right? Whether it's by law, it's by sterilization, or what happens in the 1950s. This is Mabel A. Grammer, who was a journalist that was stationed in Mannheim in Germany, and she created an initiative to have Black German children, particularly those that were under the stewardship of the state in the 1950s, adopted to the United States, right? And the German government was more than happy to oblige. And here are some ads from, I think this is from Ebony in the 1950s. And what happens is that there are a number of Black German children that get adopted to the United States by Black families, right? Because they can't be Black and German and actually be in Germany. And knowing from first-person accounts, most of these children do not know that they were adopted until sometimes into their 60s and 70s, right? And similar things happen in the aftermath of World War II in Korea, Italy, and the UK. There are these brown baby plans where Black children cannot be assimilated into these nations. And I'm looking at this through the lens of a genocidal logic, right? Really learning a lot from Native studies, Indigenous studies scholars who have written about boarding school initiatives in the United States and in Canada, where Native children were not physically killed, but they were taken out of their home context, from the reservations, et cetera, and so on, and were completely forbidden from speaking their native language, cultural customs, dress, et cetera, and so on. I think the slogan that was used for a very long time was "kill the Indian in order to save the man." And of course, similar things happen in Australia, right? With what is referred to as the stolen generation of Indigenous children there as well. And what it really has, the kind of genocidal effect it had on the German context, was that it basically erased a whole generation of Black German people, right? So that it seemed in the 1980s, when I was coming of age, that Black people had not been in Germany for any extended period of time, because so many of these children were adopted to the United States. And I think I have a little bit more time, but I think I'm going to stop here. Otherwise, I would have talked about Henrietta Lacks and also epigenetics, but if you're interested, we can talk about that in the discussion. I'll just end there. Thank you very much.